I recently published a video about Paul Sakowski, who was arrested in 1938 whilst trying to cross the German-Czech border in order to go and fight in the Spanish Civil War. This was the beginning of more than 32 years imprisonment in Nazi German, Soviet and East German concentration camps and prisons. In that video, I discussed how two of the Nazi personnel from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp tortured Sakowski, and in this video I shall examine the case of the first person he met in that camp, that of Gustav Sorge, who whipped him on arrival, as he did to many other prisoners too. Gustav Sorge was born on the 24th of April 1911 in the Ronicken district of Silesia, which is today Rojęczyn in Poland. It is located about halfway between Leszno and Rawicz. His father Ernst was a farm labourer, whilst his mother was an assistant in a gardening shop. He had a brother and a sister. The brother was killed in the Second World War. Sorge grew up with his maternal grandparents who owned about 11.5 hectares of land. At the end of the First World War, this part of what had been Prussia was transferred to Poland. According to later court documents, in 1920 his parents were expelled because the father did not come from this region, but from the area that remained within Germany. As a result, the family moved to Osnabrück. Sorge's father worked here first as a construction worker and later as a railway foreman. However, Sorge stayed with his maternal grandparents, probably so that he would one day inherit the farm. His grandparents had 2 children. The girl was Sorge's mother, but the son, who was Sorge's uncle, was an army officer in the German army, and he felt as though he was unable to live in that land which had been transferred to Poland from Germany, even though that land was only a few hundred meters from the German national border. Sorge went to a German language elementary school in Rojęczyn from 1917 to 1919. Following the transfer of the territory to Poland, there was no longer a German language school to attend, so from September 1920 he attended the Polish elementary school. As it would appear that the teachers were not locals but came from central Poland, they did not speak German. The local evangelical pastor gave him instruction in German. This gentleman was a member of the German minority in the Polish parliament. Sorge left elementary school in 1925 as one of the best of 16 to 17 students. According to his later testimony, Sorge stated that he had little hope of being able to take over the farm of his grandparents because of his German nationality. In fact, this is not the case. Article 93 of the Treaty of Versailles obliged the new Polish state to protect the ethnic minorities and their property within its borders. Nonetheless, Sorge began his apprenticeship as a blacksmith in April 1926 with an ethnic German master blacksmith in Bojanowo, which is around 3 kilometers south of Rojęczyn. There were 4 people doing the apprenticeship, the other 3 being Polish speakers. Because of his German citizenship, he was only allowed to stay until the end of his apprenticeship, or so he said. In 1929, he passed his apprenticeship examination with the grade very good and then worked for a year as a machine fitter. He claimed that in 1930 he had to leave his home. He first went to his uncle Herman, his mother's brother, in Breslau, which is today Wrocław, around 100 kilometers from Rojęczyn. Perhaps he did not wish to rejoin his parents because he wanted to stay closer to home, and he also had many friends in Breslau. He also had closer contact with his uncle than with his parents. In the end, however, he complied with his parents' wishes and moved to live with them in Osnabrück at the beginning of 1931. Because of the general economic crisis at the time, he could not find permanent work there. At times he reported to the Employment Office for emergency work, but in general, until March 1933, he was mostly unemployed and dependent on unemployment benefits. In the meantime, he continued his education in courses set up by the Employment Office, in particular to improve his German language skills. To understand his mentality, we need to have a closer look at the border situation where he came from. The majority of the population in his home area were Polish-speaking, and this area, for that reason, was transferred to Poland after the First World War. Although his father, who was a German nationalist, did not exert much influence on him because of the geographical separation, the influence of the pastor, his teacher, and above all, that of his uncle, who repeatedly pointed to the former size of Germany, was all the stronger. The teacher, who was also the chairman of the German minority group in the Bojanovo area, treated him as his own son. The uncle in Breslau drilled into him during his frequent visits that he was German. He had been an army officer during the First World War and was unable to adapt himself to life outside the military. He was in contact with the Black Reichswehr, a sort of secret army founded by the German army to get around the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles and which assisted other paramilitary organizations, particularly in the border fighting with Poles. His uncle also joined the Nazi Party at an early age and was local group leader in Breslau from 1930. Under the influence of his uncle, Sorge tried to be employed by the Reichswehr in 1930, but was turned away, allegedly because of his insufficient knowledge of the German language. Thanks to his uncle's mediation, however, he was able to join the Black Reichswehr from January 1931. He took part in theoretical and practical military training once a week in a barracks in Osnabrück, and in July 1931 on a 4-week exercise at the Sennelager military exercise area near Paderborn, and took part in another similar exercise in nearby Höxter in September 1932. He joined the NSDAP, the Nazi Party, and the SS in January 1931. According to him, the decisive factor in joining the SS was that a large proportion of the participants in the military exercises were SS members. He was a member of the SS group in Osnabrück, which before 1933 had around 60 to 70 men. In the political disputes in 1931 to 1932, it fought in street battles, mainly with members of the Red Front Fighters League. It seems it was here that he was given the nickname Iron Gustav. The reason for this naming was his participation in a street battle in Nordhorn, some 50 kilometers to the west of Osnabrück, in the summer of 1932 with members of the Red Front Fighters League. He said that he jumped out of a truck and waded into a group of communists whilst wielding a club. When Hitler came to power on the 30th of January 1933, Sorge said that he did not get involved in the celebrations and have initially not known anything about the imprisonment of political opponents. On the 1st of May 1933, the Nazis held a celebration of the workers' holiday, and even trade union leaders who had opposed Hitler joined in. The Nazis showed how much they appreciated that support the following day when they outlawed organised labour. Soga was present when the trade union building in Osnabrück was raided and he saw the officials being arrested. It did not bother him, of course. He believed that the trade unionists were criminals who should be brought to justice. Soga first learned about the concentration camps in the summer of 1933. At that time, there was a concentration camp in Esterwegen in the Emsland near the Dutch border. The SA guards from there came to Osnabrück on leave. From them, Sorge heard that there were members of dissolved left-wing parties in the camps. Of course, the existence of the concentration camps was no secret, and in particular this one. It was openly discussed, particularly after a sermon by the Bishop of Osnabrück, and when Prussian Prime Minister Hermann Goering gave a Christmas amnesty and ordered that it be closed down. As early as the summer of 1934, the concentration camps in Emsland were set up again under the name of Justizlager, justice camps. The guard was provided by SA men from the Osnabrück district in police uniform, but with the rank badges of the judiciary. At the time, Sorge was still at his regular job. In March 1933, he got a job as a locksmith in a weaving and spinning mill, and after a month switched to the Osnabrück copper and wire works, where he stayed until September 1934. He continued to perform his role in the SS in his spare time, and in September 1934 received the rank of Unterscharführer. Due to a decree of the Prussian Minister of the Interior about the reinforcement of the police with national auxiliaries, he had to give up his job and was called up to the guard command of the Esterwegen concentration camp on the 1st of October 1934. There were then around 300 guards. He retained his rank and was used to guard the prisoners in the camp and at their workplaces. He had around 25 to 30 members of staff who were subordinate to him. He, in turn, was subordinate to the camp commandant, Obersturmführer Loritz, who was later his superior in Sachsenhausen. The camp was organized in a similar way to the later Sachsenhausen concentration camp. At Esterwegen, Sorge learned how to be a concentration camp guard. The 10 SS men sent from Dachau informed the other staff about the origins of the prisoners and how to treat them in the camp and on the construction sites. 150 prisoners were in the camp when Sorge came, and 500 by the time he left. The camp commandant also informed the guards of the reasons for the so-called protective custody order issued by the Gestapo. Sorge learned that, even in the case of criminal inmates, their admission to the camp was not because they had been convicted by a court, but because they had been sent there by the secret police. Reasons for protective custody warrants included, amongst other things, rioting or resistance to state power, in both cases obviously fictitious. The first Jewish prisoners came to the camp as early as 1934. The camp commandant did not give any specific reason for them being there, but the guards knew. A Jew was automatically particularly suspicious for racial reasons. In 1935, when conscription was introduced, those refusing could also find their way into the camp. The guards were told the disciplinary rules for guards and prisoners drawn up by SS Obergruppenführer Eicke, the former commandant of the Dachau concentration camp. Sorge, as did every guard, flogged the prisoners, which took place about 2 times a week. Sorge became aware that the inmates could no longer walk after being beaten, had to be carried away, and were unable to work for several days. He saw inmates with hand and foot shackles and who had to wear them for long periods outside, regardless of the weather. Sorge was aware that these punitive measures were taken, among other things, because of allegedly poor work performance. Some of the prisoners had contact with outside staff when working on some projects. Sometimes these workers would complain about jobs not being completed satisfactorily by the inmates. Sorge claimed that initially he did not pass on reports from civilian workers of this nature. However, there is no doubt that he did pass on these reports although never bothered to check if this information was true or not, irrespective of the consequences for the prisoner. Sorge became brutalized seeing other guards also behave in this manner. He would punch inmates in the face for no apparent reason or kick them until they could no longer work and had to be brought back to the camp by fellow inmates. At this camp, he also saw for the first time how a prisoner was shot dead while trying to escape. In April 1935, the guards were given the title of belonging to the Totenkopf Sturmband Ostfriesland. In April 1936, Sorge was assigned to the Ordensburg Vogelsang. There were 3 Ordensburgs built in Sonthofen, which is in southern Germany, Swarczyniec, which is now in Poland, and at Vogelsang, which is today in the Eifel National Park, close to the Belgian border. Sorge was a guard, but here he was keeping people out rather than keeping them in. The role of the Ordensburg was that of education and training of future Nazi leaders. Now, Sorge was an SS Unterscharführer with a detachment composed for this purpose of around 60 men, mostly old fighters for the Nazis. His role was not only that of a guard, but also that of training. Race issues were discussed often during the political training. Whilst he was there, he met his future wife. She was also a staunch National Socialist and was employed as a maid at the Ordensburg. They were married on the 27th of March 1937. The result of this marriage was 2 daughters and a son. After about 3 months, all the attendees of this course were sent from Vogelsang to Oranienburg. Further training took place here with the aim of using the course participants later as trainers. The training was of a military and ideological nature. Once more, the race question was also discussed in particular. It was said that the Slavs had to be pushed back to the Urals, whether they wanted to go or not. With regard to the Jewish question, Sorge said later that he gained the impression from the lectures that a solution other than emigration to Madagascar was planned. Liquidation was mentioned here for the first time. Given that the suggestion to send Jews to Madagascar was not made until 1939, and the decision to mass murder the Jewish population of Europe was made in 1941, I think Soga was getting his dates mixed up. In September 1936, when Sorge was promoted to SS Scharführer, he was assigned to the Section 5 of the SS Economic Headquarters, which was responsible for planning new concentration camps. In 1938, he took part in the invasion of Austria. After a meniscus injury had healed, he was transferred to the command headquarters of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp at the end of June 1938. In the meantime, in the summer of 1936, the Esterwegen concentration camp with guards and prisoners had been transferred to Sachsenhausen near Oranienburg. The number of prisoners was now 5,000. Sorge was initially appointed as block leader and promoted to SS Oberscharführer on the 9th of September 1938. After a short time, he was called in to work in the field of labour service and report leader. It was at Sachsenhausen that Sorge met his future court defendant, Paul Sakowski, in the 1947 Berlin trial. Sakowski, then 18, had been caught on the Czech-German border trying to make his way into Spain in order to participate on the government side in the civil war in that country. Sakowski was greeted by Sorge with a whipping, the point of which was to show that he had no rights in the camp. Sakowski came from a communist family. his father had been imprisoned in Esterwegen, and it is possible that Sorge had come across him too. Until the spring of 1939, he served as the Deputy Labour Service Leader and as the second report leader. He was then employed as the first Labour leader, and in this position was promoted to SS Hauptscharführer on the 20th of April 1941. In October 1941, Sorge achieved the highest position possible for somebody of his rank in a concentration camp, that is to say, the position of first report leader, which he held from the 22nd of June 1942 in personal union with his position as first Labour Service Officer. He then took over as camp or command leader of a larger fieldwork command of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp stationed in Berlin-Lichterfelde, Wismarstraße. In November 1942, Sorge was relieved and transferred to the Central Labour Mission in Oranienburg. As a reason for the replacement, Sorge later cited differences with the camp leader about a punishment, which Sorge did not consider to be justified, of a block leader subordinate to him for mistreating a prisoner. In contrast, two witnesses and Sorge's wife later testified that he was accused of stealing SS property. For this, he was posted to the front, although as it happened, he did not end up at the front, only to the occupied Netherlands. In January to February 1943, Sorge organised the labour deployment of the newly established Herzogenbusch concentration camp in Holland and then returned to Oranienburg. In April 1943, he was imprisoned for 3 months as part of an investigation ordered by the SS leadership into abuses in various concentration camps. However, Sorge was released without further punishment. Then he was involved in the planning of the Riga construction project. 30,000 Jews were deployed in the armament-producing factories in the vicinity of Riga. In the summer of 1943, he was assigned to the office of the higher SS and police leader Ostland. It was initially used for a short time in partisan operations. But on the 1st of December 1943, he was employed as the camp leader of the Riga Spliva concentration camp, which comprised of around 2,000 Jewish prisoners. 2 weeks later, he also took over the management of another slave labour camp for Jewish prisoners in the Eastern Army Vehicle Park in Riga. In this case, however, only the workers were under his management, not the army vehicle fleet itself. On the 1st of January 1944, he took over the Dondagen slave labour camp on the Gulf of Riga as camp leader, in which there were around 10 to 12,000 Jewish prisoners. After the Soviet breakthrough in Operation Bagration, Sorge transferred the prisoners to Stutthof, which is east of Gdansk. In November 1944, Sorge was ordered back to Sachsenhausen and set up the 12th Construction Brigade there, which consisted of 1,000 prisoners from the Sachsenhausen, Gross-Rosen and Mittelbau-Dora concentration camps. The brigade was to be used in the Ardennes offensive for road construction and repair work. It first began working at Münster am Stein and in Niederlandstein to repair air raid damage. During the operation in Niederlandstein, Sorge was injured in an air attack and lost toes on his left foot. After staying in various hospitals, he was taken prisoner by the United States Army on the 28th of April 1945 in the Berglengenfeld military hospital near Regensburg. In May 1945, he was taken to the SS internment camp near Bad Kreuznach and 6 weeks later to another camp near Wickrath. He escaped with another SS man, and returned to his family in Osnabrück. He moved with his father to Flammersheim in the Eiskirchen district between Bonn and the Dutch border, where he found work as an agricultural labourer. On the 24th of March 1946, he was arrested by the British military police in Flammersheim and taken to the Recklinghausen internment camp. In 1946, he was handed over to the Soviet military police. After numerous interrogation sessions and various prisons, he was charged with a number of other functionaries of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp before a military tribunal of the Soviet occupation forces in Germany for crimes committed at Sachsenhausen. Whilst on remand, he found himself back at his former place of employment, Sachsenhausen, although this time he was one of the prisoners. In the preliminary investigation and during the trial, Sorge admitted all allegations. The Sachsenhausen trial was held from the 23rd of October to the 1st of November 1947 in the Town Hall of Pankow in Berlin on the legal basis of the Control Council Act No. 10 of the 20th of December 1945, which formed the legal basis of Nazi war crimes trials. In the dock, alongside Sorge, stood 12 other former members of the SS camp personnel of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, 2 former prisoner functionaries, and a civilian from the Reich Ministry of Economics who had experimented with endurance drugs on a shoe-walking track. Most of the members of the SS camp personnel were accused of participating in the murder of Soviet prisoners of war, and all of the accused were also accused of being jointly responsible for the criminal camp regime. The Soviet military tribunal was composed of experienced Soviet military lawyers. Lieutenant Colonel Mayorov took over the chairmanship of the Soviet military tribunal in the Sachsenhausen trial. The prosecutors were the public prosecutor F. Belyaev and his deputy Nikolai Kotelya. Soviet lawyers were assigned to the defendants. This war crimes trial was one of the few publicly managed by the Soviet Union. The press was invited from various countries, and an audience which included future leaders of the DDR, Wilhelm Pieck and Otto Grotewol. The focus of the investigation into the criminal case at Sachsenhausen was the mass murder of thousands of Soviet prisoners of war in the autumn of 1941. A total of 27 witnesses were summoned, 17 of whom testified in the proceedings. The general defense was based on the argument of superior orders and the threat of punishment for not carrying out those orders. The defense attorney of Sorge, the attorney N.P. Bello, argued that Soga had only worked at Sachsenhausen until June 1942 and had not returned to the prison camp. Soga had committed these crimes through the example of his superiors and the Reich administration. This in itself, in my opinion, was rather a weak defense, as Section 47 of the Military Criminal Code in force at the time of the offence stated, if a criminal law is violated by the execution of an order in official matters, the superior who issued the order is solely responsible for it. However, the participant's penalty will be meted out in the following circumstances. 1. If he has exceeded the order given to him, or 2. If he knew that the command of the superior concerned was an act which was intended as a civil or military crime. With this line of defense, the accused would have had to pretend that they did not realize that they were committing a crime and that someone had forced them to join the SS in the first place. Sorge was charged with the other suspects, August Hörn, Kurt Eckerius, Wilhelm Schubert and Fritz Ficker of the killing of thousands of Soviet prisoners of war at Sachsenhausen. Sorge admitted that he was involved in the shooting of 25 prisoners between December 1941 and May 1942. Sorge also admitted that he had beaten prisoners severely for the most trivial reasons. He said, "I personally beat inmates every day, using not only my hands and feet, but also sticks, boards, any heavy object. I hit people for any reason and for no reason, for coughing or speaking, for not looking sufficiently cheerful, for picking up a cigarette stub, for smoking during work hours, or simply because the face of the prisoner seemed too serious." 14 of the 16 received life sentences and 2 received terms of 15 years, all with hard labour. The prisoners were transferred to the Vorkuta penal camp in northern European Russia, about 2,000 kilometers to the northeast of Moscow. Conditions were so bad that by the end of 1948, 5 of them were dead. Coal had been discovered there in 1930, and mining it was the predominant work of the inmates. Rations were low and could be deducted if work norms were not met, thus encouraging inmates to give better productivity. Miners did have the right to wash, unlike other prisoners, but that was only if water was available. It needs to be pointed out that whereas this group of Nazi criminals were sent there for punishment, the majority of the victims were anti-communist intellectuals or people picked up at random, not only from the Soviet Union, but also Poland and East Germany. In this way, mass killers suffered the same punishment as people who were completely innocent. In 1955, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer visited the Soviet Union. As a result, in January 1956, prisoners were released, although without an amnesty. That is to say, they were expected to serve out their terms in West Germany. One of the Soviet interrogators advised Sorge to go to the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany when he was released, as he would have to reckon with a trial in the Federal Republic for his actions in the concentration camp. Nevertheless, Sorge insisted on being released to live with his family in the Federal Republic. On the 14th of January 1956, he was handed over to the West German authorities with a transport of non-amnestied prisoners. A few days later, he was released and he stayed with his family in Flammersheim. On the 7th of February 1956, he was arrested. In a trial before a jury in Bonn from the 13th of October 1958 to the 6th of February 1959, he was accused of personally committing 67 murders. One of the people who he killed was Professor Leon Sternbach, professor of classical philology at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. He was arrested for being a professor of the said institution on the 6th of November 1939. Professor Sternbach, who had an international reputation and many publications to his name, was 75 when Sorge murdered him on the 20th of February 1940. In the new Jewish cemetery in Krakow Kazimierz, there's a symbolic grave to Professor Sternbach, which you can see should you find yourself as a visitor there. I think I need to also point out a very important difference between the Soviet and American trials. The Americans charged the accused with as much as they could, meaning there was nothing left when the German courts later wanted to charge them. You may have seen that in other videos I have done about Nazi criminals. However, in the case of Sorge, the Soviets had concentrated on the mass murders which took place after the war started against the USSR, meaning that the killing of German and Polish citizens before this time could be prosecuted by the West German authorities. Sorge was sentenced to life imprisonment. In 1978, he died in prison. So thank you for listening. The main source of this discussion are the trial records from the 1958 to 1959 trial. Some information comes from the earlier trial as well. If you have found this interesting, please subscribe. I try to upload at least one video per week. That's on a Friday evening at 8 o'clock Central European time.